Well, you wanted it. There were so many comments on the last video requesting one solely dedicated to low key, and I can hardly go ahead and ignore them. Besides, why would I not want to do such a video? It's freaking low key after all. We looked at a couple of Puro related low key incidents in the previous vid, mainly that time when he went into the Tokyo Dome in Agent 47 cosplay, had an awesome match with Prince Devitt and Kota Ibushi, and, thanks to doing it in a suit, totally burned his bridge with New Japan to the point where he will never ever be going back there. That's the quintessential example of the low-key paradox. It's something awesome that also screws something up. And of course there's so much more to look at. I wondered how to go about this. Should I mix the good and the bad? Because the thing with Ki is that yes, he is a talent, someone who had quite the influence, one of ROH's founding fathers. But honestly, even when you try and go through that, it's not too long before you run into him being a total prick, doing things that are just unforgivable, whether it's refusing to job, being too stiff, throwing tantrums, taking himself too seriously, burning endless bridges, all sorts. To flip between the good and the bad would be too much of flipping from one extreme to another, so really this video has to focus on the bad. There will be opportunities in other videos, I'm sure, to talk about better things, matches that came off beautifully, things that happened in the first few years of Ring of Honor and so on, but I don't think that's what you've come here for, and it certainly wasn't what you requested. And so this video's going through the worst of someone who may well be, at times, a wrestler like no other, but ultimately there is just too much bad shit that can't be ignored, and eventually, like so many bookers and promoters over the years, you just give up on him. Here is the worst of low key. To begin with, we need to look at the story behind a rather infamous photograph. We're going all the way back to 2000, even before Ring of Honor, and a time when low key was actually much more of a high flyer than he was a striker, and he was primarily working for Jersey All Pro Wrestling. However, CZW is where we're going for our first taste of bad low key. Yes, it's that picture where Ki's having an absolute tantrum and gets picked up and dragged out by a burly bouncer. What exactly was the story behind that? Well, it happened on March the 18th, 2000 at a show called Expelled, in a tag match where Low Ki and Mercury took on Rick Blade and TCK. Now, if you know CZW, you're likely familiar with Rick Blade, as he was one of the company's most notable high flyers and daredevils in its early years. Footage of the tantrum itself is tricky to come by, to say the least, but the match itself is out there, and it was a bit of a mess. Indeed, Low Ki nearly hurt himself very badly early on in the bout, trying to do a phoenix splash off a ladder to the outside that goes completely wrong, and he ends up nearly spiking himself on the frickin' apron. Honestly, it's a wonder he wasn't seriously hurt there. Later on, it's Rick Blade's turn to go wild. He climbs on top of a basketball hoop and performs a leg drop through a table onto Mercury. Again, it doesn't go as planned. Blade ends up just short, falling back hard and absolutely twatting the back of his head on the floor. He is legit knocked out. TCK and Low Ki continue in the ring, with TCK superplexing Ki through a table, but eventually it becomes clear that Blade is absolutely knacked and that the match needs to be stopped. What should happen at this point is that TCK pins Ki to end it, but Ki kicks out. Still, the 3 is countered, and the match ends. It's very confusing, especially seeing as it's Ki's music that ends up playing. Presumably his team was supposed to win the match. Anyway, the post-match is cut from the video, but Low Ki felt that the whole thing was a screw job, something to do with bad relations between JAPW and CZW. He was angry at not being able to get all his moves in, and yeah, he threw a huge tantrum right there in the arena, shouting the whole place down, with the infamous picture being the result. Not exactly a good look, considering that Rick Blade was quite bashed up, but Ki clearly couldn't be told any different. Unsurprisingly, this was the end of Ki's short time in CZW. Short of a brief match on a show promoted by CZW and Dragon Gate USA, he's never been booked by the company again. That's the first bridge to be burned and, well, it won't be the last. With that introduction out of the way, the worst of Loki is something that's easy to break down into segments. There are multiple examples of him being too stiff or refusing to job or whatever, so it's easy enough to group them, and we're going to start with his absolutely reckless strikes. First up, we're in 2002. This is Ring of Honor, where Loki truly broke out, where most of the matches against the likes of American Dragon, Samoa Joe and AJ Styles are amazing and seriously worth checking out, where he was the inaugural champion. Most everything that Ki did in 2002 was great, but even here there is still a black mark, a moment where he was way too stiff, whether it was by accident or by design. A moment where you realise that the reason those kicks look so good is because, well, they're live rounds, and Ki doesn't exactly subscribe to the old rule that when you throw hard, you should generally do so in soft places. The first of a few examples here comes from the first round of ROH's original title tournament when he's up against Prince Nana, who is much better known as a manager nowadays, but he did used to wrestle. Nana gets the advantage in the match by attacking Ki before the bell, spending a couple of minutes on offense before Ki dodges a hip attack. Ki hits a couple of chops and then BAN! Lights out. A ridiculous headshot that ends the match right there. Ki wins by knockout, seemingly concussing Nana. I'm not 100% sure whether this was the intended finish or not, but either way it is something that kind of reinforces a bad attitude. It's not exactly a satisfying finish, and not really what the crowd wanted to see at all, even booing it a little and acting quite concerned. Kinda shows why you generally don't book someone, even if they have got a shooter type gimmick, to win by sudden knockouts and the like. It's just not satisfying for a wrestling audience. The second one also comes from ROH from the following year. This time it's the card's main event, with Loki against Dan Maff. We're a little over 10 minutes into this match and things are starting to build up nicely. Loki goes for his tidal wave springboard kick and BAM! Catches Maff utterly cold. Knocked out. It becomes clear after about 30 seconds of Maff simply not moving that this match cannot continue, at which point Loki pins him. Absolutely atrocious end to a main event, or indeed any match, and quite clearly not what was planned. Now you could put both the Nana and Dan Maff spots down in isolation as accidents, which they probably were. This ain't ballet and all that. But when you've got them both together, well, it feels more like recklessness, and of not doing exactly what should be done in order to protect the other guy that you're working with. Which, well, is obviously one of the cornerstones of being a frickin' pro wrestler. You can't really go past that. There is another Ring of Honor example, also from 2003. This one isn't a main event. Instead, it's a match against Deranged, who was a part of the Special K group, a rather lousy crew of ravers that were feuding with Ki at the time. This one seems to be set off by Deranged coming in with a handspring for a spot that ends up being rather awkward. He gets blocked, they teeter around for a bit, Ki puts him down, and then... oh, Jesus! Loki just goes absolutely wild with the Kawada kicks. There's clearly several of these rapid fire shots that connect, although thankfully nothing connects enough to knock Deranged out. These rapid fire Kawada kicks on the ground are a common Ki spot, but this one feels especially filled with stank, particularly with all the hair grabbing and the Koppo kicks and so on, and you do kinda wonder if Ki got a little bit heated by the awkward spot preceding it. There is certainly a difference in how spots like these are perceived these days, to be honest. Unlike the first two examples, this isn't a spot that finished the match, which obviously Ki went on to win despite various Special K shenanigans, so generally the reaction back at the time would have been, "Whoa, awesome! Loki's a total badass!" and all that. Nowadays, when this clip gets pulled up, or others that we're going to go through, not so much, to be honest. It's kind of more along the lines of, ugh, Loki is such an asshole. Our fourth and fifth examples come from tournaments outside of ROH. Neither of these finished the match in question, but they feel worse than the previous ones, because To be honest, one especially just doesn't look like an accident at all. First, it's the final of the 2006 Ted Petty Invitational in IWA Mid-South. Ki versus Roderick Strachan versus Eric Cannon in an elimination-style three-way dance. Ki goes wild with the strikes as normal, puts Roddy on the ground and... boom! Soccer ball kick. Roderick Strachan is immediately knocked out. I mean, for fuck's sake, Ki. Ki grabs Strachan, but it's clear he's done, and he just pins him, eliminating Strachan from the match. If this hadn't been a triple threat, well, obviously that had been the end of it. As it is, Ki ends up submitting Cannon to win the match and the tournament. The match itself went 35 minutes, and the knockout of Strachan happens around the 27-minute mark, but it is still another incident where, honestly, Low-Ki can just piss off by this point. Next, there's the final of PWG's Battle of Los Angeles in 2008, Low-Ki versus Chris Hero. We're not far into the match, there's another strike exchange, Ki knocks Hero down and... yeah, there you go. Soccer ball kick, again. Busts Hero's nose right up. In this instance, it's not a knockout and the match continues, with plenty more stiff shots between the two, and Hero absolutely cinching in a few submissions hard as something of a receipt, but again it's Ki who ends up winning. In fact, it's said that Hero was originally booked to win this, until of course Ki complained and threatened to no-show if he didn't win. What a cock. Hero himself has commented on this a couple of times, once simply calling it the opposite of professional. And yeah, you can't exactly disagree with that. I mean, he just flat out kicked him in the head. Not even fast. And then of course you have the most famous of all the Ki knockouts, one that's gone viral several times and is assuredly one of the biggest examples of just how much of a dick he can be in the ring. It's January 2012 and Low-Ki's making his debut in Evolve, wrestling against Atu in an open challenge. It's almost a reunion of sorts. Once again, Low-Ki is working under Gabe Sapolsky, the ROH co-founder, the guy with the book when Ki was at his peak. And mere seconds into this debut, I imagine that Gabe was wondering why the hell he bothered. Ki's pumped up, Atu wants to take his best shot, the bell rings and... yeah, you know it already. 1 second into this match. First move. Atu is out. Completely. Fencing. The worst thing is, it's not even the end. We wait like a minute and a half, Ki posing around like a dickhead all the way through, for Atu to show some semblance of life, to try and prop himself up, just so Ki can roll him out of the corner and do the Warrior's Way. Because he has to get his shit in, against an opponent who is quite obviously too concussed to take it. I love that during this, the idiot commentator says that Low-Ki has never looked better, when all he's done is completely blindside a guy. What an absolute clown. What an arsehole. Jim Cornette went viral for laughing like hell and absolutely scorching this whole thing, and frankly, he was right to do that. It's one of the dumbest and most reckless things I've seen in a pro wrestling ring. Shockingly, Ki's time in Evolve didn't last long, seemingly ending due to his increased New Japan commitments, but it's kind of irritating that he was even booked again after that first match, to be honest. Still the same as ever. So yeah, there's just a few examples of Ki being ridiculously, recklessly stiff, and I'm sure there's plenty more. Hell, he even managed to do it in WWE, but I'll get to that later. Listening to various people talk about Low-Ki, whether they're people who don't like him or those who do have more time for him, common themes do emerge. Generally, Low-Ki is as intense in the locker room as he is in the ring. Incredibly serious about the wrestling business, of course, to an extreme level even, a point that can be too much for some people to deal with. And when it comes to matches, there's often a lot to discuss, especially when it's something that Low-Ki doesn't particularly agree with. We're talking lengthy meetings that always seem to go a bit like a guy saying, well, this needs to happen because this and that and so on, and Low-Ki repeatedly responding with, well, but why would I do that? I'm Low-Ki, and I'm a legitimate ass kicker who could beat everybody else up. And on it goes. When you hear folks like Jeff Jarrett, Dutch Mantell and Conan speak about him, you do see rather quickly why Ki is considered to be pretty hard to work with. Homicide, the guy who trained and mentored Loki, and is certainly one of his best friends in the business, admits that this sort of intensity can be way too much for a lot of people, once putting it succinctly by saying that Brandon's cool, but Loki can be a dick. This sort of intensity and the need to go over things in such detail seems to be a major turn-off, especially seeing as it mainly happens if it involves something that isn't just Loki goes over. As you might have guessed, getting Loki to do the job can be quite the struggle. There's plenty of stories of him refusing to do so, or at least having major arguments about it. Hell, we literally just saw him win the 2008 Battle of Los Angeles because, if he hadn't been booked to win it, he'd have walked out and screwed the whole tournament. For that is the way of the warrior. Staying with PWG, there is the story that Kevin Owens, or Kevin Steen as he would have been then, told, in which, back in 2011, he had a massive problem with losing to Claudio Castagnoli, who was the company's top star and champion. Oh, and a human horse, as Steen puts it. Eventually, Loki did do business here, the match happened, it was good, and Claudio won, but the mind does kind of boggle somewhat at this whole deal, wondering just why losing to the top guy would be such an issue. Like wanting PWG to change its whole direction just like that so that Loki can be catered for. Just kind of ridiculous. When looking at the stories of Loki not jobbing or having massive problems doing so, it kind of makes me think back to that match in 2001 where Eddie Guerrero, freshly out of WWF, starting his journey all over again, put the young Loki over in Elks Lodge. Great match and a great moment. But it's not exactly something that Loki would end up paying forward, is it? Not that he would have ever done this, but I wonder if things would have worked out differently if Eddie had turned around and said, well, that doesn't work for me, Hermano, and Jim Hellwig the piss out of him in 2 minutes flat. I wonder. As we get near the end of Loki's time in ROH, there are a couple of examples of pretty obvious interference in how a match should have ideally gone, beginning with 2 matches with Austin Aries from 2004 and 2005. Now, Aries is a major prick himself, even more so than Loki, but it's amusing here to see the lengths that Ki goes to in order to not properly lose a match. Firstly, on December 7th, 2004, there's a number 1 contendership match for the ROH World title that ends in a 20-minute time limit draw. 5 more minutes are announced, but Ki, well, he just walks off. Now, Loki was ROH's top heel at this time and wasn't playing by any code of honour, which is how it's justified in storyline. But still, it's not exactly a satisfying ending, and not a satisfying build-up for Aries, who gets the number 1 contender slot anyway and ends Samoa Joe's epic title reign on the next show. An old David Bixon span tweet reminded me of the next one. Months later, we have what should really be a simple title match between Aries and Ki. However, it ends up being an unsanctioned non-title match. In storyline, this is because Ki is kayfabe suspended for striking an official, but the crowd in NYC, Ki's hometown no less, quickly figure out just why these stipulations are in place, especially as these guys proceed to wrestle what is probably the cleanest unsanctioned match in the history of wrestling, scarcely even leaving the ring. Of course, it's all set up this way so that Loki can win, which of course he does. Big surprise. The feud with Jay Lethal, I think, also warrants a mention. Lethal, an up-and-coming star, had been teaming with Samoa Joe and feuding with Ki and the Rottweilers, showing a lot of fire throughout even if he was often the one taking the fall, and it should really all be a setup for Lethal getting that big win over Loki, particularly at Glory by Honor, one of the company's biggest annual shows. But again, it kind of ends up awkward. They have 2 matches on the show. First, a fight without honour, a great match which Loki wins. Later on, with Colt Cabana and Homicide going to a DQ, we get more antics, Lethal comes out to challenge Ki again, and this time he wins. Still, It takes 2 matches and a whole bunch of Rottweilers, Joe and Cabana shenanigans, and a super finisher for it to actually happen. It all does feel a bit overbooked for ROH, and it's kinda clear why that is. Feels like it would have been better if they just had a freaking awesome 30-minute match rather than 2 good 15-minute ones. Ultimately, we get to the straw that broke the camel's back. It's February 2006, and Loki is scheduled to face Roderick Strong, another guy who's getting a heavy push up the card. However, this match never ends up happening. Loki and Gabe Sapolsky had a whopping great disagreement over pay that escalated to the point of Ki walking out with no chance of him ever being seen in the company again. It was pretty quickly reported that Ki had refused the job to Roddy, although in truth that has never been fully confirmed. In the likes of The Observer, it was reported as being over Ki demanding more money and Gabe not budging on that. It was a shame, especially considering that this came pretty soon after what was unquestionably the best match of Ki's career, his Final Battle 2005 main event against Kenta. But, well, it wasn't exactly a surprise that things would end this way. And speaking of unsurprising endings, we do obviously have to go into Kaval here. Ki's time in WWE seems like a good way to wrap this video up. Back when Ki was signed by the Fed in 2008, most people didn't really know how the hell it was really going to go down. Like, surely he's going to have to toe down his stiffness. How long until it all goes completely tits up when it doesn't go his way? And so on. I mean, you wouldn't be blamed for giving the whole thing a couple of months tops before just going to shit. In the end, Ki spent a little over 2 years in the WWE system, although he did miss a big chunk of 2009 due to a leg injury. Ultimately, in 2010, we get to NXT Season 2 and the pairing with Lay Cool, one of those things that was pretty clearly a massive rib due to just how seriously Ki takes himself, but then didn't actually work out too badly, to be honest. They worked pretty well together, and apparently there weren't any problems at all, because it turns out Loki can actually do comedy from time to time, and that he makes for a pretty good straight man. Of course, despite being booked to lose damn near every week, and being endlessly ripped by Michael Cole in the prime of his heel persona that made the product freaking unwatchable and is actually probably worse than anything in this freaking video. Ugh. Bad memories. Anyway, Kaval ends up winning the season thanks both to the fans' vote and that utter choke of a Michael McGillicuddy promo, at which point every other rookie came out to attack him in a spot that was called out of nowhere, a complete cluster schmoz which saw Ki think it was all a proper shoot and react accordingly, at least until Husky Harris grounded him and presumably told him what was going down. It was a somewhat hopeful start at least, but it did then kind of go all to hell on SmackDown, where he just didn't get anywhere, and it was basically all jobs, jobs, and more jobs. Jobs to the point of being able to survive 5 minutes with Big Show in order to get a spot on the bragging rights team, only to lose that spot immediately to Tyler X. The highest profile match ended up being an IC title bout against Dolph Ziggler at Survivor Series, where, in a losing effort, this happened. Yep. Now this one didn't result in a concussion, but it did bloody up Dolph's nose a fair bit. And what with the WWE predilection for ribbing guys who've come in with an outside profile, and that kind of been taken to an extreme here with Kaval, the size going against him and all that, something like this happening, even if it didn't really result in a serious injury, it was always going to be bad news for him. It was kind of clear that, despite the fans voting him as the winner of NXT Season 2, Kaval was never really going to have a chance, not during this time period in WWE. He most certainly was going to have to eat a dump truck full of elephant shit each and every week in order to get anywhere, and of course it didn't work out. It wasn't exactly a surprise when he was cut right at the end of 2010, 2 days before Christmas. So how did it eventually finish? Well, there's a tidbit from an old Santino Marella interview talking about how Loki was saying that he wanted to say something to Vince McMahon's face, and shockingly enough, someone ratted him out to the management. A bit more detail about how things went down that doesn't really paint Ki in a good light has come out more recently, and that's from, Loki himself. Ki's own account of things from his 2024 Café du Rene appearance was that he was talking with a couple of guys annoyed about doing another job on TV, specifically to Drew McIntyre, a 6'5", 275-pound guy who Ki felt that if he wanted to, he could just go out there off script and make submit in seconds. Anyway, Ki was pissed and said that he should go right into Vince's office and hand him his ass. Which, yeah. Now, I assume Ki meant that he was going to go in there and loudly complain, but I can't fully rule out the alternative. Anywho, 2 days later he got the old dreaded call from John Laurinaitis, who said that perhaps it was best if they went their separate ways, as he wasn't going to be where he wanted to be on the card anytime soon. Basically, he was released, but it was brief that he'd asked for it. It doesn't seem like he was very popular in the locker room, as you can imagine considering the amount of jobbing he was doing and how much Ki just loves doing the job. He was apparently usually very glum backstage, and ever more annoyed, with having to job to McIntyre in 30 seconds being a bit of a final straw. People in management tried to cool him down when he was on SmackDown, saying that similar things happened with guys like Rey Mysterio and Eddie Guerrero, but Ki's thought on that was simply that he wasn't them, he was low-key. He's getting beaten up by all these big guys, but he's the one who's been the attraction. Yeah, it wasn't ever going to work out, was it? Thus ends Low-Ki in WWE. So, how do we best sum all of this up? We cover so much puro here. We see a lot of guys who work stiff, but there's a big difference between working stiff and doing what Low-Ki does. Someone like Toshiaki Kawada may have some vicious kicks, but he is not legitimately hurting people. If he was, then he would have concussed his opponent nearly every freaking time he threw a Ganmangiri. That didn't happen, while Low-Ki just sometimes goes way too far. It's like he gets way too heated in the moment, and it becomes really freaking reckless. And over the years, that's happened way too many times to be ignored. Now clearly the perceived values of pro-res are what Low-Ki seeks to emulate. The absolute respect for the business, taking it very seriously, keeping it real and so on. And I think that these could obviously be very good qualities to have, but Ki kind of takes it to an extreme that is just too much for a lot of people, and also ends up being very centred around himself. If there's any deviation from that, drama starts to happen, and over the years he has become more and more of a mark for himself. Almost like, well, if you couldn't beat me in a real fight, then why should you beat me in a pro wrestling ring? And it seems as though there's very few people, if any, who Ki thinks could take him in such a scenario. So, he wants to be like Toshiaki Kawada, but too often he comes across as more like Koji Kitao. The lengthy appearance on the Café du Rene podcast does provide a fair bit of insight into the man, but not necessarily in a good way. When it comes to damn near every incident that's covered, there's not exactly a whole lot in the way of regrets, never admitting any wrongdoing, always being the guy who's shunned for speaking the truth and being real. Although, well, there is only one constant in all of this. Some may wonder why Low-Ki had so many chances over the years, but then the man does absolutely have a legacy. He was one of ROH's founding fathers. He absolutely changed indie wrestling in the 2000s. He had an undeniable influence. When Low-Ki is at his best, there's hardly anyone else like him, no one else who can really project that sort of intensity. And when he's in there throwing down with guys like Dragon, Joe, Styles, Amazing Red, Daniels, Ibushi, Kenta, Homicide, it can be absolutely special. And those are still matches that if you've never watched, you still absolutely ought to. He was part of a lot of the best moments and bouts of 2000s indie wrestling in particular, and that first year in ROH, his time in Noah, the first one in NWA TNA, right up to his time in New Japan, there's a lot to recommend. Prick that he may be, Low-Ki's wrestling cannot exactly be ignored. If things were just a little different, he should have had the same sort of career that a lot of his contemporaries, guys we've just mentioned, ended up having. But sadly, it hasn't worked out that way. And in the end, well, you can't really blame anyone for that but him. Hopefully you enjoyed this video, and until the next time, bye for now.